Hi, this is Paul. Like many of you, I woke up this morning and did a few things I needed to do, and then opened up whatever media I was doing, and bang, Pope Francis had passed. And then I saw that J.D. Vance had visited not long before. The Babylon Bee comes out and says Dalai Lama quietly cancels visit with J.D. Vance, and I thought, where are the conspiracy theorists? They should be all over this. And yeah, it was Easter on Sunday last week. Again, I was gone for a lot of the week, and so was quite busy. And then working to get my sermon together. Didn't have a rough draft for Sunday. Had two sort of regular thinky talky videos on Saturday, and then the release on Monday, and then of course this news. And so responding to someone had posted on CRC Voices about the CBC. And no, he's right. It was interesting because New York Times, CBC, everyone sort of has the mass media in America sort of has its boomer take on Francis, and the boomer take on Francis is usually, you know, who am I to judge? This one line that he gets early in his papacy, and certain other signaling that Kale had mentioned. I just finished listening to Kale's little blog on this, and Kale and I are going to get together and talk about this. Probably do a live stream it on both of our channels. And it's it's just so interesting how fast things are changing. This, of course, is on the heels of the great um, tempest in the space left behind by the IDW, I'll call it that, where we're trying to figure out sense making. This weekend, Konstantin Kisin, important person in the space left behind by the IDW, very much comes down on we need standards, we need evidence, we need experts. And I caught on no. Yeah, there it is. I caught on Twitter someone saying Brett Weinstein is the only member of the IDW left, and so I watched the little clip from Brett's much longer live stream, and he's basically touting his I got COVID right, and the free press and Quillette didn't get COVID right, so I'm the true heir of the IDW. It was also interesting to note that Brett, like my channel, Brett's channel's just sort of kind of plateaued. He's been in the 400Ks for a very long time. I mean, he didn't sort of continue to rise like Jordan Peterson did. I haven't paid attention to Sam Harris's following. Of course, Douglas Murray is getting gray unless he's coloring his hair. And Sam is, again, I've had this little membership to Sam's YouTube channel so I can get some behind the scene things like the question and answer. Boy, are they super interesting, and it's really interesting listening to Sam now. It's much more sort of a some of these guys that sort of felt white hot in 2016, 2017, 2018, like Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris have cooled down considerably, and it's interesting to see where they sort of land. And they land that were they aspiring experts and elites to assume the kingdom of the expert class that they originally dethroned. So it's just watching the conversation is very interesting. And this afternoon, I was also listening to Rhett McLaughlin on Alex O'Connor, which is a riveting conversation, and thinking about this with respect to the whole emerging church movement. He was a little bit clearer on sort of as time goes by, clarity increases because probably nuance and details recede. So Very interesting watching his conversation with Alex O'Connor. Alex, of course, his channel has continued to grow. Chris Williamson has continued to go. But Brett, for all of his, I got it right. Okay. And it's interesting listening to, let's say, if you imagine in this civil war of podcastanistan, it's interesting how both Brett and Sam want to sort of camp on rationality. So Sam wants to camp on rationality will enthrone the experts that we should listen to, and Brett wants to imagine the continual effort of rationality and of first principles thinking and of free speech will lead us to the continually evolving truth. But in a way, the appeal that he makes in his podcast of, hey, we're the original article, we got COVID right, you should keep listening to us, not Barry Weiss and Quillette and Douglas Murray and Sam Harris and all of these sellouts that have sort of pulled up the ladder behind them in the castle of rationality. We continue to practice true rationality, and our burgers are best. I loved, so I'm really looking forward to it. As soon as I saw the news, I thought, oh gosh, I want to talk to Kale. I want to talk to Kale because all of this. Okay, one thought at a time can only come out of your mouth, Vanderclay. Make an effort to finish your sentences. Make an effort to communicate to the people, and people like you. I'll be personally offended if no branding comes out of that little moment. I was thinking through before the Pope Francis thing came out, the news came out. I was thinking through this sort of the two sides of the IDW civil war, or the civil war that's happening in the space left behind by the IDW, where you've got Sam and Douglas. We need new standards, and Brett nicely lays this out. He said, when the IDW is coming up, we need new institutions. The old institutions can't be saved. But the real question beneath this are, can institutions themselves be lived without? Because that's sort of what you have in Podcastanistan or Podcastistan, or let's just keep calling it the space left behind by the IDW. And that, of course, really comes to the fore in the question of the death of Francis, which is, well, maybe I should read some of what I wrote for Voices this morning. Right now in Podcastistan, it's easier to write than it is to say. In the space left behind by the IDW, there's a furious debate going on over some buyer's remorse over new media. Konstantin Kissin's made an ethnic joke because he's an ethnicity. You've got Konstantin Kissin and Douglas Murray, and I assume also Sam Harris, so I listened to Sam a little bit later, on one side, and the likes of Brett and Heather on the other. The moment I heard that the Pope died, I thought, I can't imagine what the next papal conclave is going to be like. But then again, one of the things that I tweeted out to Kale, that y'all have been sort of watching the drama / misery of the Christian Reformed Church in the last 3 years. Now the whole world is going to watch yours, Roman Catholic Church. And so issues like polity and structure really matter in these institutions. And of course, the College of Cardinals, who of course are selected by the previous popes. Wow. Talk about a legacy institution. But the irony, of course, of this moment is that with this boomer culture that is that is leaving. And again, boomers all over the world just celebrated the half measure of who am I to judge from Pope Francis early on. Everybody imagining, and it's like, imagining what exactly? What when Pope Francis said that, what did you finally imagine he was going to do in the Roman Catholic Church? Like women priests and gay marriage? Did you think that he would just sort of write this off and it would be so? Again, the longer that I've had the privilege of having more and more friends in the Catholic Church and in the Orthodox Church and in the varieties of the Jewish world, and the more I look at the Roman Catholic Church and I'm like, what is it? Really? What is it? And maybe that's kind of easy for me to imagine because the Christian Reformed Church is this tiny little thing that's only a little more than 150 years old. It's hardly anything compared to the Roman Catholic Church. But this question about institutions. No, Sam Harris says, we need new, better institutions. And Brett is sort of, no, we just need, we don't need an institution. We need an ever-evolving process that will continue to lead us in greater and greater light. And of course, you've got Mary Harrington sitting on the sidelines saying, y'all still believe in progress, do you? In my conversation with Sam and Elizabeth Oldfield, when she introduced context collapse, I thought about how an environment of what appeared to be context collapse, you get natural communities of reactivity. Online is especially susceptible to this because there's so little shared context. So everyone can just sort of project and fill in the context that they're addressing, which is deeply idiosyncratic, or at least of their tiny little experience or community. And then, like Paul Vanderklay and Joe Rogan, go out into the internet and offer our unsolicited advice, and people look it up and people are like, well, maybe Paul Vanderklay doesn't move the needle, but Joe Rogan does. I'll drop that little clip in here from that conversation. What a good moment in that. What a great conversation that whole thing was. I'll put the whole link to that conversation below.
It keeps coming to me, and it's one that I first came across in Jenny Odell's book, How to Do Nothing, is context collapse. And the way human communication is designed for in-person communication, right? Even before we had the technology of writing, we would talk to the people in front of us, and we could read their body language, and they could read our body language, and there was a very specific context. And then as writing takes over, and you are there's more distance between the parties that are communicating with each other, but there's still some sort of bounded context. This is something that's being said in a newspaper. This is something that's being said in a theatre. This is being said in a personal letter to one person. This is being proclaimed at Speaker's Corner through a megaphone. And all those forms of communication are subtly different, and they have different purposes, and they intend to have different effects on us. And the internet just comes and slams a giant, I got an image of just a massive breeze block on all of that social infrastructure, and context collapses. And so the ability of a priest or a pastor to say something careful and biblical and pastoral to a small group of people is very different from what you're doing, Paul, which is mass communication. Although I think actually what's lovely about the little corner is it feels like a kind of attempt to almost recreate a familial feeling context in these disembodied forms of communication, which maybe gives me more hope that we're like, okay, no, we can't live with this context collapse. We cannot live with just unmediated information, some of which is profound theological truth, and some of which is absolute nonsense, being pumped at us all day, every day through the same device. We have to learn again how to discern context. And I'm really feeling the way that chaos has some really effects that I find very interesting and life-giving. Like, it has allowed parts of what I think are profound theological truths like spin out of their previous context, their container in the church, and end up, in different feeds, in different spaces, like seeds scattered to the wind. And that, I think, is part of what's drawing some unexpected people and some of this spiritual openness. But it's also meant that the structures and the social infrastructures and the communities by which we used to discern what is true and false, what is life-giving and what is unlife-giving, what is humanizing and what is unhumanizing, in my language, what's going to make us more like Jesus and what isn't, have gone. And because I increasingly agree with John Vervaeke that meaning is a communal concept that actually cannot have meaning, I think you probably can't even have truth, like in your own head, which is why I hate Descartes. That is a problem for our ability to be. Jonathan Rauch, who's an atheist, but I think has some very interesting things to say about the church and where it sits now, would say to remain a reality-based community. I think, the ground of reality is God. But to remain a reality-based community, we have to keep having these structures that hold us together in collective discernment. And that's what I think is the challenge of this moment.
Yeah, and context collapse, and also a lack of shared and mutually reciprocally known context.
Yeah.
Like back when, radio and television were first coming online, there was only a few stations, there was only a few channels. And in many ways, it increased the shared context for people over a larger geographical distance. Whereas previously your shared context would have been more your neighborhood and things that you could know around you. Suddenly now you can have a giant radio station broadcasting the same audio over a giant geographic area, and that brings people into greater sort of shared context in some ways, while also killing a lot of the local particularities along the way. But now, what started as a sort of a unifying force, for better and for worse, has become an individuating force. I feel like, just because there's so many different things. And then the other weird thing is that previously there was no way to really, like if you're listening to the radio or the television, because people lived more densely and because those devices were precious, you often were sharing them with other people, and you could know all these other people listen to the same thing that I did. And if I talk about this at school or at work or whatever it is, there's a decent assumption that I can make that you heard what I heard. And even if you didn't happen to listen to that channel, it won't seem weird if I bring it up. And that sort of thing. But nowadays it's like, and I feel like this is particularly challenging and weird in churches, because I feel like previously, maybe this is still a little bit naive, but in church, most people were spiritually formed and theologically informed by their church and by their church community. And nowadays, a pastor might have, like all of these competing influences that they don't even see what they are, dragging, their congregants' attention and spiritual formation and theological ideas in a whole bunch of different directions. And a lot of people can be kind of private about those sorts of things. And so that it becomes, what exactly is the church? And are you more formed by your favorite theological, YouTube channel? Or are you more formed by your church? How do you deal with, anyway, all of that complexity? Paul, you look like you have something to say.
Well, I think I really love what you said, Elizabeth, and you, Sam, too, because this context collapse and a lack of a shared story, or at least even a shared experience, I suspect that increases what we're seeing, that reactivity itself then becomes the communal experience.
Wow,
Because, I often think about the fact that if you, again, let's think about perhaps you have the collapse of Roman civilization, you have medievalism. Great many people sort of live in what we would call a natural environment where, let's say, the rhythms of nature, the changing of the seasons, the planting and sowing, animal life, all of this sort of becomes a basic phenomenological substrata by which, and then you have, say, the mythic church in the center of the village with the steeple. And so it's very much you can have a nice little monoculture. You have all these monocultures side by side. Of course, you have these great stirring experiences like the Crusades, where suddenly you have massive exchanges, but so much of the population is living in their own little monoculture. And obviously part of what the internet, especially with the collapse of, let's say, the second world, which was the communist world, and globalism from the late 80s into the 90s, and then cable television, the internet, all of what we see again is sort of a rise in reactivity, because all of us can't help but live in our own little monocultures of one, or maybe our family, or maybe our church, or our village, or community, or what have you. But now all of the other monocultures and some much more dominant cultures sort of thrown at us. And at some point, we're going to see something that makes us react. Mm. And so then instead of having sort of these coalitions around belief or practice or shared experience or shared narratives, we now have these massive communities of reaction. Where, it wasn't a surprise to me when I saw sort of the rise of the woke. I thought, if you don't like the woke, wait for the anti-woke, because the anti-woke, that's going to be massive. Because if you're sort of building your monoculture on gender or race or orientation or something like that, fringes have fringes, and the summation of all of those fringes will inevitably be far larger than your little monoculture.
Yeah.
And so, but the difficulty with that, of course, is all of this reactivity is parasitic. It relies upon a hegemon to push back against. And what we've seen in sort of the weirdness of the last few decades has been, people have noted that, for example, in the United States, dominated by, let's say, the boomers, and they're all reacting to the man. The difficulty is that the boomers are reacting, all sort of passed away in the 70s and 80s. And they're not around anymore. So then you get this conservative reaction to them that says, no, we're reacting against the hippies and the boomers. And
you get Francis Collins is still singing protest songs on the Capitol Mall after he's been removed from his position. Still out there being Woody Guthrie fighting the man with his 6-string guitar. Yeah.
That's right. I think this is one way of understanding what happened in the Christian Reformed Church over same-sex marriage. Same-sex marriage for the CRC is the kind of issue for which various contexts within the church didn't matter as much, and so reactively a coalition could easily be drawn together. And that's sort of what Abide was. Ever since the synods and the CRC, there's been some continual drama around Abide. In my conversation with Aaron Vriesma or Vriesman, those Dutch last names. He said, well, once the same-sex marriage thing is revolved, and Abide will say mission accomplished, and off we go, and we'll shutter the thing. And so it's like, hey, I think you guys could probably shutter it. This is a done deal in the Christian Reformed Church, but they haven't. And then there are whispers that the general secretary asked them to keep it open for a while, and I told him, you guys should probably shutter that, because what sort of happens and sort of happened in the CRC after Synod 2025, when 2024, sorry, Synod 2025 is still coming. I will be there in Toronto, Canada. Synod 2025, Synod 2024, when basically, yep, this is a done deal, and either you get along with the new regime or you go packing. Well, very quickly, Abide became the scapegoat for the theft of the denomination from the elites and establishment that previously sort of ran things, and they're all sort of kicked out very swiftly. And it's a dramatic, traumatic experience for many of them. you could easily gather edges, like churches in post-Christian California and millennial male, young, restless, and reformed churches in suburban West Michigan, and the sort of the conservative classis of Minnesota to agree on one issue. This, of course, completely swept the old ruling elites and transformed the denomination. And so it was, in that way, it was just sort of a boomer push out. We're pushing out this whole West Michigan, East Grand Rapids class of reigning boomers, and out we go. And I just saw Kristen Kobes-Dumay on her Substack said, what if we had a new gospel coalition of the real gospel? And it's like, yeah, this is why you need a confessional conversation, because you're going to want to ask yourself, what is the real gospel? And in many ways, lurking beneath the same-sex marriage fight was this question, well, what exactly is the gospel, and what exactly is the church, and how should it be lived? I love how Cale talked about the fact that I've been thinking a lot about the propositional tyranny in certain Protestant denominations like my own, as compared to the not really the participatory so much, but the procedural tyranny. I read in one of the books that I was reading about how this one particular, was it a whole bishop or just a priest? He had baptized all of these people, and he had one word wrong, a fairly, not an unimportant word, but not a terrifically important word. It's not like he didn't baptize all these people in the name of the Father, the Son, of the Holy Spirit. No, they're all Trinitarian baptisms, but they got one word wrong. And so all of the baptisms that he had done were nullified because he got the word wrong, which makes the change from the Latin Mass to the vernacular Mass, I mean, yeah, Cale was exactly right, really crucial in that context. And of course, you cannot understand Vatican II apart from what had happened in the Second World War in Europe and what had happened to Catholicism in Spain and Catholicism in Italy and Catholicism in Germany, and really what had long been happening to Catholicism in France. Catholicism purports to be this, to transcend these national boundaries, and in many ways it does, better and more than any other major church in the world. Yet, when I read O'Malley's book on, I really should pick it up again and take some more looks at it. Probably not going to have time before I talk to Cale. When you look at Vatican I, Gallicanism versus Ultramontanism, and when you look at what happens post-Franco in the Catholic Church and what happens to the church in Ireland and what happens to the church in Poland, it's super, and then what happens to the church in Quebec. It's the Catholic Church isn't disconnected from the context within which it's embedded. And thinking about Trent Horn's video that he did on Protestantism and Catholicism in America and this free fall that's going on. And Cale mentions the springtime. That's sort of what people are looking for. The next stage in the Christian Reformed Church will continue to be, okay, now what? Okay, so we've sort of made the Christian Reformed Church safe from the kind of boomer liberationist push that's just push. And for a decade, at least a decade, I'd been watching this push, longer than a decade, 20 years. I've been watching this push on these liberationist issues, and I've been watching the confessionalists get more and more annoyed. I've been watching their coalition build. And quite clearly, others deep in the pocket of Grand Rapids had not been paying attention to this. So finally, when COVID happens and there's sort of a sea change in terms of everybody's belief in the expert class, then the whoosh happens in the Christian Reformed Church. You have this great sea change. The former elites and establishment are all pushed out, and sort of at this point, sort of the young male millennial West Michigan leadership is kind of emerging and taking charge. But a lot of the rest of us are kind of like, what's this going to mean? And some are nervous. Some are very nervous. I'm just temperamentally not really a nervous guy. So I'm out, what, me worry? Some of you other boomers remember Alfred E. Newman. Some of you who don't know who he is can look him up. In that risque junior high magazine called Mad that boomers used to read before we had the Babylon Bee and other more esoteric enjoyments. The next stage of the Christian Reformed Church will continue to be, okay, now what? Where there'll be victorious confessionalists realizing that there probably isn't a faction to oppose them, but the cat herding over compliance and buy-in on whatever they think the next big thing should be is going to be really tough. Because again, you have these reactive coalitions that, all right, what we no longer want to do is get week after week after week of the same kind of stuff that you might have gotten from the World Economic Forum, just in sort of a sanitized, distilled, evangelical-ish, mainline-ish Christian Reformed feed that we keep getting. That stopped. But what exactly is make the 16th century great again? Is that what it's going to be? Because I don't really see this new group so much as that, even though many of them are out there crying, the confessions, the confessions, the confessions. The massively diverse Roman Catholic Church has long had a cat herding problem. Francis is tempted, I think, to address it by selectively leveraging the boomer liberationist vibe, and I think Cale will be able to fill me in on this, which of course the Western media picked up on fawningly, but beyond that failed in a variety of other agenda items, and I don't know enough to know what. I'm sure there's an enormous list that we're going to be hearing over the next few weeks as people think about what comes next. The growing dynamic edge of vitally critical Western church is conservative to reactionary. Again, if you just keep even a little bit of an eye on Catholic news media, young priests are conservative. We look at our own Father Eric in the corner, a man I really love and esteem greatly. Very knowledgeable, very winsome, very wise, very conservative, very Catholic. And I think if this is the kind of priest that is going to be in the Roman Catholic Church, well, I greatly respect him. But even America is a tremendously diverse place. And will that bring the much needed springtime? Again, I go back, I should find that quote where it was probably from a Ryan Burge piece, where you look at the Catholic and the mainline and the evangelical, and you look at this wide diversity of churches that sort of held this enormous population in North America. And with the rise of the nuns and the decline of church attendance, someone's looking for something to come in and in one way replace. But again, a la the video that I released this morning, I tend to think what instead we're going to see is sort of this mushy, nominal, post-industrial, which sort of brings me to, someone like Rhett. And even Rhett, though, listening to him, and he did a video recently that Algo served up, where he was talking to some new spiritual but not religious. And again, my sister's podcast. It's going to be interesting to see how that goes. But my sister's podcast, it's going to be pretty spiritual but not religious, I suspect. This massive population in the United States that's sort of in that crew and in that tribe recently people Rhett's age, people my sister's age. So my sister's a couple of years older than I am, so she's more boomer than me. But it's going to be interesting to see what happens with them. And of course, in this marketplace of marketplace of churches in America and other religions and religious things, everybody's looking at those nuns and thinking, could I be the religion that's not a religion? Of course, John Vervaeke dropped that. But I think in many ways, when you listen to Sam Harris, that's exactly what he's looking to become. That's why he made the app. First it was New Atheism is going to be, well, it's not going to be a religion, but New Atheism is, and people have long given up on that. Listen to Justin Brierley's conversation with Bethel McGrew and James Lindsay. I thought it was a lovely little conversation. And James Lindsay is just sort of in that agnostic space, but he's kind of on the other side of Brett. But again, if you look at James Lindsay and Rhett, James Lindsay is like, I don't know if I believe in the Jesus stuff, but it's attractive. And Rhett's still in the phase of, I'm trying to get rid of a bunch of this stuff that I now look at as not terribly good. And so I really do have to listen to that other thing that Rhett made. And again, often when I listen to these, I don't learn anything new. It's sort of confirmation when I listen to him talk. I've listened to plenty of other normies talk, and it's like, yep. This is pretty much, you're just sort of following along this track that I've seen how many other people follow. And now an interesting thing is going to be, I don't know, of course, I know nothing about his particular marriage, but he talked about his wife a fair amount in this. And sort of what sometimes happens is that once they get out of sort of a church container or traditional container, then some of the temperamental differences about men and women begin to express themselves in this wide open spiritual marketplace that the nuns are continuing to kind of develop. So the American Catholic and the Catholic Church, the American Catholic Church is tremendously important to the larger Catholic Church, has been for a very long time. Just because of money. Yeah, money. And I think I don't know, and I'm really anxious to hear from Cal. I don't know, again, if you can understand what happens in the Catholic hierarchy after the Second World War without understanding, as in so many other levels of life, the Roman Catholic Church in the post-war United States is absolutely centrally strategic for the future of Catholicism, as I think imagined from Europe. Today you might say, well, actually Africa and Asia are probably more important than America in many respects, partly because of just the cratering of participation of Catholicism in America. He felt out of step with the conservatism of the growing African and Asian churches, yeah. And in fact, a lot was made of his Latin American roots, but Latin America, you're still sort of following the Spanish Latin trajectory, and Latin American Catholicism, they sort of put forward the liberation theology horse, and the Pentecostal evangelical horses just completely outrace them, and have been for a long time in Latin America. And probably to the degree that the Catholic Church has any sustaining powers, because they're figuring out how to compete against the evangelicals and the Pentecostals in Latin America. So to bring someone with, let's say, liberation theology credentials from Latin America to Europe, looking back on it, they would have been much better with an African or an Asian pope last time around. And Han Shu is hoping that they'll get an Asian one this time around. Maybe. But again, to what degree are cardinals lagging indicators of what the church needs now? I have no idea. His backstory in Latin America seemed on point with a post-World War II liberationism, But the real growing edge is Latin America. In Latin America is our Pentecostals and evangelicals. He never really convinced anyone that the hierarchy was serious about coming to grips with the sexual abuse scandals, which have undermined so much credibility in the church around the world. It's such a difficult thing to get to, but again, and I know very little about it, but I read Rod Dreher regularly, and I listen to Cale Zeldin, and that's something that needed to go away. It needed to be resolved, and whatever you did, whatever lengths you had to do to get rid of pedophile priests should have happened. And to hear, Larry Chapp and others talk about the level of the male gaze at the Catholic seminary is apparently something very different than in the gym down the road. I'll say it that way. Figuring out figuring out what to do with liberationists like the synodical Germans will be costly in any direction. And this is me knowing like nothing. This is all of the critiques of Douglas Murray and Konstantin Kisin and Sam Harris about that idiot Vanderklay. He's out there and he's just pontificating and blowing on things he doesn't know. Fortunately for all of you, the channel is small and I love the pushback. And what's really wonderful about saying things I know little about is that many of you are ready to correct me in the comment section. And most of the time, I learn a ton from you in the comment section, even when you come in hot. So, which gets me into this question that I started with about, say, Brett versus Douglas. I have less confidence in the rationalist process theology of Brett Weinstein and more confidence in trying to, as best one can, build and foster and feed a community around you that can help you do the sense making together. And I really thought about that listening to Rhett's conversation with Alex. He had Link. He didn't have anybody to talk to about these things because there's so much that can be said about this. And what we tend to see is that people are sort of working in this narrow column. And in many cases, let's say from the perspective of the community that I've been privileged to participate in, I see him sort of creating this foundationalist column that I think there's so many more questions than you can ask instead of just, say, having these two options. I'm going to give up my Christian faith because, and I know he talks about that very clearly in this. People are trying to tell him, there are theistic evolutionists around there. And I completely understand the way he's saying that, because they're assuming that you can just trade this one little piece and the rest of the column will stay the same. And he's much more like, no, at the bottom of my column are certain ideas about how the world works. And I say, yeah, and there are more ideas about how the world works than the two options you're looking at, because you just sort of jumped from one column to the adjacent column. That's kind of what you did. And your questions about how deep this goes, and that's where, say, putting it next to where James Lindsay is at, is really interesting. Ultramontanism might be over, as no one believes the time or the place can produce the last golden papacy of John Paul II for many trads. But again, I think, Cale's going to really help me with this. Everywhere is Podcastistan now being Christ. Now being Christ's vicar on earth might be a very frustrating thing. I'm pretty sure it almost always is. It's fitting to pray for the Roman Catholic Church now. It's obviously a deeply important church in terms of the Church of Jesus Christ in the world today. Everyone's got problems, but I'd still not trade mine for theirs. Thank you very much. So Hank, still a Protestant, Hank, still a Protestant. But of course, this got me thinking in terms of, I had that sort of accumulated body in Saturday morning's podcast on the thumbnail. And again, I think we need I have the real privilege of getting to talk to a lot of people. So we had a wonderful Sunday estuary meeting. I continue to do Randos conversations behind the scene. Maybe I'll get that Wednesday link opened up again now that things have sort of settled down a bit. So many people out there are trying to put things together, and I think and doing their best because they have to. And of course, the people who find me, it's a sample because they're participating in the corner. And the reason those people who are sort of staying in the corner and working the corner and using the corner to be able to do their work of sense making and putting things together is, well, is the corner an institution? Well, not really. But it is a thing. But I think, yeah, a community is a more helpful thing because it's much more adaptive and flexible and gives us more of what we need. All right. It's probably enough for this. I got to drop that one clip in and leave a comment. Let me know what you think. Tell me everything I got wrong, please. Please.
Midwestuary 2025, August 22nd through the 24th in Elmhurst, Illinois. A weekend you won't want to miss with special guests Cale Zeldin, Paul Vanderklay, Rod Dreher, Elizabeth Oldfield, John Vervaeke, and Jonathan Pajot. Midwestuary 2025, the Fellowship of the Spirit. Stay tuned for more details. Visit us at midwestuary.com for ongoing updates.
Well, I don't know about the meaning crisis, left, right, black, white, or other vices. Which Jesus Christ is right, or if we're all saved. From my perspective, our propositions participate procedurally, running in circles. Remember in body, we're in the age of decay. Symbolically speaking, the reapers are reaping, them damn egregores are whispering sweetly. We're all NPCs in the belly of the beast. Red pill, blue pill, bread pill, Mars Hill, or DMT, or whatever you feel. Got one and number two, it's all the same damn thing. So clean your room, repent on Zoom, ontology for dummies, a bird's eye view. 'Cause if you really knew, could you really even say? Totally depraved, all totally saved. A total disposition from the bed we all made. Or is it the elect? Or are we just insane? From John Vervaeke to Jonathan Pajot and Jordan Peterson to the Chris Pacou Show. Paul Vanderklays and Griswold Grimm and all the dice he shakes. This estuary ditty is a little bit cringy, ain't quite the U-shaped or the hero's journey. All the NPCs in the flood treading water to watch you save the day with a bunch of chitter-chatter. From the ortho bros to the Catholic Joes or atheistic Jobs to Protestant folks, the Joe Schmoes and Jewish Jacobs and everything in between. So love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul, with all your mind and your fingers and toes, all your neighbors too, as if they were your own. So love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul, and with all your mind and your fingers and toes, all your neighbors too, as if they were your own.